Hello, welcome to the J Plus R movie podcast, and today we will be discussing Neon Demon by Nicholas Winding Refn. To basically give a kind of plot summary as best as I can, basically revolves around Jessie, this girl who goes to LA to become a model. We kind of see her experiences rising up in the industry, but also her catching the eye of many other people, including makeup artist Ruby, who starts to look out for her, Dean, this photographer who tries to romance her, and these various other models who are catching how her innocence and youthfulness is in some ways helping her get ahead, come higher in the industry, and things then become very weird and disturbing.
Very, very disturbing film. I would call it an extremely blunt film. It uses that bluntness to kind of create a horror, almost like if you took the modelling industry, stripped away a lot of the bullshit, injected it with a massive amount of cynicism, and then showed that cynicism straight up. That's how I describe this film.
Are you talking about the entire film or just like the first hour or so?
About the film generally, it becomes more symbolic as it goes. The first one is a very realistic, more objective look at things, especially when you start getting the conversations, get the stuff at the diner, which I'm going to go into. And then I think as it goes on, it becomes metaphoric. Even for a lot of the second half, it doesn't seem a million miles off until the big thing happens that I'm not going to spoil yet. We're going to spoil that one later.
I would say as it goes on, you're definitely right on it being symbolic. I think it also becomes a lot more unreal as well. It starts out somewhat grounded in reality, but then as it goes on, you kind of realize that what you're watching is a lot more supernatural than you expected, a lot more fantastical than you expected.
I would go with fantastical. I wouldn't go with supernatural as such, but fantastical I would.
The supernatural stuff is more just implied than outright shown. How I felt, so I agree with everything that you just said. For me personally, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think that the film is absolutely carried by its style and direction and cinematography, the direction, the camera work, the music, the sound design. All of it helps create this film that really is more of an experience than anything else. You can analyze stuff about it, but I think largely speaking, what it aims to do is it aims to suck you into its world and give you this, again, experience that isn't always literal, and some instances has to be looked at symbolically in order for it to work.
I think the characters in it, the plot's quite thin, but I also feel like that might be part of the point. I think its style is absolutely something that just really makes it work, especially color-wise, because you go from these more stark colors into
stark white, especially in a couple of the scenes.
Oh, yeah, like stark
photo
white,
shoot and
just
stuff.
lots of highlighting, very harsh, and the colors start blending in, especially those deep pinks and purples and things like that, especially as you keep going forward. Kind of reminiscent of some of his other films, especially like in the bathroom scene where it's all that kind of purple. No, that feels real, but it also is the first time where you're like, whoa, this is a little bit.
Are you talking about the bit where Sarah does the blood sucking stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I am talking about that. I was talking about just the bit in the bathroom where they're all
Red Rum, the lipstick scene.
Red Rum lipstick. Yeah, I was just like, okay, this is where we've gone.
So that stylistic quality, I think it's at its best at the beginning of the film, because I think the film starts off very, very well. It has this great opening credits. You don't typically see in movies anymore, like that kind of opening credit sequence, where it's just purely text on a screen, but with a lot of flair added to it. You have the great score by Cliff Martinez going on in the background. Again, it gets you sucked into the mood, and the style immediately starts hitting you. It helps introduce you to the world that you're going to be in for the next 2 hours. As it goes along, that feeling never really subsides, I feel.
I'd say it's quite a consistently objectifying and just subtly disturbing tone. Like some of the early sequences, for example, when you just see all these aspiring models in a white room just sitting there with each other, you really get they're not people, they don't talk, so you get nothing but their bodies in a white room, and you're kind of there like, oh, okay. It kind of really hits you with how uncomfortable the process is.
Especially because the only ones speaking are the people who were basically auditioning them. They're the ones who are mainly speaking, whereas anybody who's a model in that scene doesn't really say anything. Sitting there, stand up and walk, that's kind of all they do. And that tone, it's one that I've never really seen be applied to that industry before, but honestly, it actually does go hand in hand. And anytime we get a scene of them just doing a photo shoot or whatever, you don't get the same pleasure that maybe you would looking at that in a magazine or looking at photos like that on the internet.
almost feels like busy work.
I would say at best it feels like busy work, but at worst it sort of just feels kind of uncomfortable, particularly like that opening bit, for example. I mean, I highly doubt that would ever actually be put in like a mainstream modeling thing of like her with her like throat slit, like in the makeup that looks it looks like her throat has been slit, unless it's some sort of alternative art magazine or something like that. That I think sets up the tone, and that also then leads to other instances. Again, you're not given the same viewing pleasure that you would typically.
I think it is distancing. I think that's something to the film's credit, because it lets it then act on that symbolic level later. Because I would say I did not connect to a character really in this film. They're more symbolic of certain functions and opinions than they are people. And I find that really, really interesting. Because, I mean, I suppose that's, on one hand, an indictment on the industry. When they're sat at the diner and they're ordering food, if their only focus really is on what it looks like and what it will do to them.
The bit where it's Ruby and the other two models and they're just like sitting down and then they just like, oh, okay, should we get this? I don't know if we should get this.
It's really interesting to watch their desires being subsumed like that. I think one thing the film does show is that the agencies of these women, especially the older ones, kind of been completely stripped by the modelling industry. And the only things they're worried about is who's having sex with who's getting ahead how, and when their expiration date is up.
The film is operating on both a very unsubtle level, but also on a subtle level. There are like details that you might not pick up on, especially not on first viewing, because although there is a lot of foreshadowing, it's not like so heavy that you can just predict what's going to happen.
Oh, no.
So there is stuff that can benefit like a rewatch as well, but there's also stuff that anybody could get. The most unsubtle scene by far is the bit where the casting director guy and it's him and it's like Dean and Jesse are both like in that restaurant, and he's just straight up saying, no, beauty is the highest like currency in the world, and Dean is just straight up saying, no, I think you're wrong.
Yeah, I mean, that's just very, very obvious, because it just lets you know that these women are currency. It's kind of like, in this film's world anyway, they're purely objects of consumption, which is a really interesting takedown of the modelling industry.
Especially by the end of it, you kind of realise how that can basically make the women do terrible things as well.
Let's talk about that ending now, because I mean, Jesus, they like straight up eat the competition.
I do appreciate that they didn't actually show it. You just sort of imply it, but you know that that's basically what's happening. But I also do have to admit the third act is where the film, I felt, started to lose itself. That is where shock value starts to get in the way.
Yeah, I mean, especially when Gigi throws up her eye and then suddenly he's trying to almost cut that out of her, which is really weird. It's sort of like she feels guilty for constantly, stepping over competition, yada yada. And it's like, yeah, I guess there was that attempted shock value and symbolism that you almost didn't need, because there's already a subtle shock value to the whole film.
I would say that is probably the most graphic and explicit scene in the film, and that the rest of it less so, or just in different ways. I'm not as much talking about that. I probably have to summarize some stuff that happens in the film. So the Ruby character is set up as this mentor figure to Jessie, but then as the film goes onwards, you kind of realize that her intentions aren't so pure, and that leads to a scene that I didn't really like. I mean, it was disturbing, don't get me wrong, but I could have done without that necrophilia scene.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even sure what the point of that really was. I think it was an attempt to kind of show that her desire is sexual and almost predatory in nature.
And she applies that to like a dead body. Character-wise, I can understand it. She got rejected, so she's, no, you know what, I'm just going to fantasize and I'm just going to do it on this like dead body. So on a character level, yeah. But on like a narrative level and even on a symbolism level, you do have to stretch to try and make that a part of the rest of the film. I mean, it could have been removed, but also when you do something like that, and this is kind of more of a personal feeling, it can't help but feel self-conscious. It can't help but feel like just an attempt at being shocking. As cinema has like progressed and stuff, it's where when you make a film and you release one that has really disturbing, explicit like content, it sort of feels like it's almost being done more for attention than it is for artistic reason. Although I think that the cannibalism in the film does have an artistic reason behind it, the necrophilia one, again, you have to kind of stretch to have it be part of the film, because otherwise it just sort of feels like Refn just thought to himself, I just want to be disturbing.
Yeah, I think that sums up a few parts of this film. I think that really causes some issues as you watch it, because what I was really enjoying was kind of just all of that really subtle undercurrent of that discomfort that was just maintained. And it almost got interrupted by those bigger moments for me.
This is more in the third act than it is in the first two acts. I still see what you mean. And you are kind of right, because, like, you know, some of the more effective moments in the film are the more subtle moments, like that bit where Sarah tries to suck the blood from Jesse's, you know, cut hand, or even the implied off-screen rape that is just purely audio. You know, we don't see anything, we're just purely hearing it, and that is really, really disturbing. Even scenes where, like, nothing really disturbing is happening, you're still unnerved. The runway scene where Jessie undergoes that transformation, it is a very unsettling, bizarre sequence because it's purely visual, and it almost feels like her mind is being lost to narcissism. That's kind of what they try and do with, like, the Jessie character. I didn't entirely buy that just over the course of one photo shoot that she'd become very, very narcissistic.
I think I get it in the moment. She might have been like that with her own experience, but I don't see how that would have become a permanent thing necessarily. I can get you getting caught up in the photo shoot as a temporary, but then they try to imply that's just how it then went.
Because afterwards she, like, brushes off Dean. Afterwards she has this slightly more, like, snooty attitude about herself, and so it is a transformation, and it's a great sequence, but it's not really clear how that's become, like, a permanent thing. And I do think that the characterization is a bit stronger than how you felt about it. I do actually think that the film does have characterization. I agree with you that it is more like there for the purposes of representing certain things the Refn wants to, like, get across. So the photographer is clearly supposed to be some sort of representation of the kind of creepy photographers that you get in the industry, but at the same time, though, they don't really go far enough with him. He's played for creepiness. We don't really get the implication that he actually has done anything bad.
True, but I almost feel like the look that he gives, you know, like the way he's looking is bad enough.
And his monotone voice, creepy, strange, short sentences as well. And this kind of leads me to one area that I did kind of have a bit of a problem with. The points that you bring up are quite good about how the film is commentating on the industry. But I do feel like if Refn was trying to critique the industry, I don't know if he really pulled it off. Do you think he pulled it off?
Yes and no. I feel like he effectively communicated the atmosphere that he sees in it, but by pushing it to such a ridiculous place, he almost undercut his own point about halfway through.
By having the cannibalism, and by having
more the way he did it, like, because it was almost so out of left field.
If he had, like, kept it a bit more real, it would have gotten across the point more.
If he'd been a little bit more unreal from the beginning, because he almost switches, and for me, I didn't find that it had the best transition between.
Yeah, you are right, especially because, like, at the end when we're seeing Ruby, like, clearing up bloody mess that they've left, you see that she has, like, these, like, tattoos that seem to imply that she might be some sort of witch or vampire or whatever.
Not needed, I feel. I could even see them doing the vampire thing, to be fair. The idea of, you know, all the beauty and the innocence being sucked out by the industry so that it can commercialise it. But if you're going to do that, you need to hint at it sooner than they did.
And there are things in the film that you could maybe say are like hints at the supernatural early on. They're so open-ended that it's not really clear that that is the case. For example, some people theorized online that the wildcat sequence, that wildcat animal was Ruby's, like, alternate form, but there's no hint that they can, like, change into animals or whatever, so that's just pure interpretation. And I do agree there isn't, especially because at the end you get the scene where Ruby lets out that geyser of blood. That absolutely is supernatural.
It's supernatural, not like they've got any strange powers or something. Rather use fantastical as the descriptor, because I don't think, because there's nothing directly supernatural, it's not like, oh yeah, she's definitely risen from the dead, or she's, you know, extending her life with it. I'd rather go with fantastical, like, for example, the eyeball, there's no way you can vomit that out and that's intact. It just isn't happening. But with what it's wanting to imply, like, it could work, but for me, it doesn't. I think it's because it doesn't fully set itself up that way properly. And because it doesn't, I'm primed to see it as a darkly satirical thing, tactical dark satire, but more like a realistic dark satire. Because even in the scene that I've kind of gone, oh, this is a bit odd on the nightclub thing, I could see that as an exaggerated version of a conversation that might happen. You know, like, oh, this is funny. You know, this lipstick kind of refers to sex.
Or food, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Because there are, like, moments in it where you can sort of see there being a bit of a switch. This was written by Refn and two women, and you can sort of tell the difference between scenes that were written by the two women and certain scenes that were written by Refn. Early on especially, you do have that really strange but kind of mesmerizing bit where they're watching that bondage performance, whatever that was supposed to be, in the club in a sequence that's like purely strobe lighting. It's a really well-directed sequence, but at the same time, that feels purely symbolic and not really anything that's important to the story.
Which, to be fair, is fine, but it's not supernatural symbolism.
I don't know if there are performances like that in nightclubs in LA or whatever, but I mean, there could be.
It's LA, though. Who knows?
So that is true in the sense that you have these bits that feel like they take place in reality, but also you have the more, as you said, fantastical, although you could debate whether some of these things even are fantastical. I don't think that the blend is bad or anything.
I would call it sudden, and that either works for you or it doesn't.
It's sudden even early on, and it's sudden even between scenes as well.
I found that disorientating.
And as you said, that could work for somebody or it might not. But like for some people that could be a nice blend, or for some people they could be like, wow, this is really weird. We're going from this to this. It depends on how much like consistency you want in your movies, whether or not you want a bit of both or whether or not you just want one thing the entire way through. Because Refn easily could have just stripped away most of that dialogue and just had it be purely a series of strange dialogue-free, purely visual sequences, you know, or he could have gone the other way. To go back to my thing, as far as like critiquing the industry goes, if I have a problem, it's that I think he maybe aims it at the wrong target.
Yeah, he aims it at the models, I feel.
At first, he is trying to be like the men in the industry are kind of trash. They don't really care about the women and they're just like purely exploiting them. But by then having the reveal at the end that Ruby, Sarah, and Gigi are kind of this like trifecta, and presumably they might have done stuff like this before, who knows, of people that then devour the innocent underage Jesse. I feel like he unfortunately ends up sending off this message that I didn't like. I know that the industry can be like super competitive, even if we're just going purely symbolically. It comes across as a bit like mean to like be models and the makeup artists are the true people to fear.
Do you know what I think would have been interesting? They've taken those older people, mix them in with the guys in the industry to show that the whole bloody system is predatory. That would have been a fascinating point.
Have them be the people eating Jesse at the end.
Yeah, I think if you involved more people doing it, that might have been interesting. Like you get that.
Oh, more people. Okay.
You get the mogul in, you get the photographer in, and I mean setting this up a little bit more in the start as well, because I would have wanted to see a bit more setup to it. But you get maybe a female exec in as well, and you sit there and you just show that the model is consumed by the competition, by the executives, by the photographers, by everything that they do, which is almost on a symbolic level what happened to the older women to make them so competitive and cruel in the first place. Yeah, and then if you really wanted to push the supernatural further, you could literally, if there's consumption happening, and when the regurgitation stuff happens, out of the implication of that, it could really get across the point that it's a predatory thing and it's cyclical, which I think are the two problems that he wants to tackle but doesn't quite manage.
It's a bit undercut by that final reveal, the stuff that he sets up early on. There is definitely a difference between the first two acts and the third act. It feels like Refn just fully took over in the third act, whereas in the first two acts he was more held at a bit of a leash, not just in regards to content, but also in regards to like where he aims the criticism. Especially because when you think about it, although it kind of works as a twist, the trifecta that we see that are doing this cannibalism, they're all probably the least likely people to actually do that stuff symbolically. I mean, taking out the competition or something like that. Gigi and Ruby, neither of them would actually have any reason to take part in that. Sarah is the one who kind of would, because she was so jealous of Jesse for kind of stealing the thunder from her. Even then, that feels more like an example of like, vanity and wanting attention. If Sarah had been a woman like over 40, an older woman that had been then passed up because of her aging, then that would have made her doing that at the end ultimately would have worked a lot better.
I don't think she needed to be about 40, but she needed to be almost like slightly on her way out.
On her way out enough to where she could be upstaged by Jesse, by this young woman.
In this one, it was more of a fear, but if it had started to happen, I think it would have made a little more sense. But not even majorly, like if she just maybe lost out on a job, but she hadn't. At this point, the competition hadn't done anything.
That bit where she was being upstaged for it being chosen by the main casting guy. But even then, that's not like huge. That's not as big, because if she goes to another place that like didn't have her, then most likely she'd probably be picked.
If it was starting to be like she was struggling to get work anywhere, and then that had happened, it would make more sense.
But as the film plays out, it just comes off more like she's just like, again, vain and narcissistic and very like jealous.
Which may well be the point.
I don't think it's poorly written. I think it works fine. It's just if he was aiming for commentary, I don't think he's picking the right target. He does set up targets, but he doesn't. By the end of the film, it's clear that that's not really who he's attacking. He's more attacking. Again, he's more just attacking models. I guess just super competitive like models. So I feel like when you combine that with the scene, again, on its own, a very well done scene, the bit with the photographer, with the photo shoot with like Jesse, that sequence I think is very well done because it's at first sets up this disturbing thing of, oh my god, what the hell is he gonna do? And then it doesn't go in that direction. But I feel like when you take that and you combined it with the ending, it was saying that creepy photographers aren't the real enemies. Or yeah, they're creepy, but they're not as bad as these people.
Which is an odd point. Like I said, I think if it had been almost a communal attack on the institution itself,
it would have definitely been expected.
I feel like this is also expected. The idea of the models was being super competitive and that leading them to take each other out. I mean, that's not a new thing at all. That's a fairly old plot line. I feel the institutional aim, while more current and perhaps expected, would have been more interesting, especially the way he'd done it. I don't think the way he'd done it would have been done before.
I think the reason why it also kind of rubs me the wrong way, photographer stuff, is just that they are probably the most, not just in terms of like objectifying women or whatever, like, I mean, yeah, but also in terms of like, you know, assaulting women, in terms of being nasty and cruel to women, photographers are the most likely people in the modeling industry to do that, even more so than these casting director guys, or just as much. There's something more predatory about them, I feel. And you could say that there is a contrast being done between him and Dean, the other guy who's also a photographer but is more amateur, because he's a lot nicer. And you could say that in that sense there's sort of like, okay, one's bad, the other one's not. But since neither of them are shown to be doing the kind of awful shit that photographers do in reality, it then ends up meaning that he kind of missed the opportunity to maybe get across that point. I think what it just comes down to is it just depends on how you look at the film. You can look at the film in any number of ways.
If you go into it expecting an experience, something that kind of gives you the overall perhaps feeling what the industry could be like for models, I think you'll enjoy it a lot more than you will if you necessarily expect proper character arcs.
A well thought out, intelligent critique. Story-wise, there are scenes that I feel could have probably been removed, like that necrophilia scene. Probably a lot of the stuff at the motel, because really all that is just setting up a reason as to why Jesse goes to Ruby at the end. Story-wise, I think a lot of that stuff could have maybe been like exercised. Actually, I do want to talk about the acting as well.
I was impressed with it.
I'd say that everyone in the cast does a really good job. I think, however they're acting, for the most part, it's very appropriate for the scene that they're doing. And there were two standouts as well. Like, first of all, wow, Keanu Reeves, that was like an insane example of playing against type. Holy shit.
Yeah, like that was, it's not exactly the wholesome image you expect from him, is it?
Nor the badass, nor the goofy. This isn't like Neo, this isn't Ted. This is basically him just playing a character so sleazy that even the word sleaze would be disgusted by him. I've always really convincing, actually. It's like, wow, he can actually play a really disgusting, slimy human being. And I think that bolstered the motel sequences.
I especially agree because it kind of refutes his star image so severely that it makes you uncomfortable before he's even opened his mouth when you look at him, because he looks sleazy.
This is probably the least appealing that he's looked in a film. Even just sort of the way he moves and the way he acts, like before you properly see him, he just walks to the door slowly and just goes, yes. Him just bored looking at his phone, him going out for a cigarette. It's not the kind of acting that feels self-conscious. It feels more realistically like he just doesn't care. And then when he's like really in the thick of it, being a jerk to people, acting really rude and aggressive, you know, I think that's also really convincingly well done. Like in that sequence with Dean, he's just being weird, because on the one hand you do get that sense that he can say and do what he needs to say and do, but he also backs it up with this needlessly insulting demeanor as well. And then you obviously get the undercurrent that he's probably a pedophile as well.
Yeah, which is disturbing.
I mean, you don't know for sure, because in the sequence where he goes into Jesse's room and puts a knife down her throat, which was really like unsettling, you don't really know if that's a dream or not. Then when you hear that off-screen rape, you assume that it's him, but you don't know for sure if that is him or not.
That's an extremely tense sequence, I think.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. Even though I don't know if in reality Jesse would instantly go to Ruby. In reality, she probably would have just like called the police and like that was going on.
She was quite scared at that moment, and it could be quite hard to call the police about that kind of thing.
You're a scared 16-year-old.
Yeah, going to Ruby, who has kind of seemed like a comforting figure.
Yeah, I also want to talk about Jenna Malone as Ruby, who I think also did a great job as well. Yeah, she did have that nice girl vibe, but I feel like, particularly when you know what's coming, there's something really creepy about her performance. She seems way too enamored with Jessie. It's shown in her voice. It's shown in the fact that she's always looking at her like she's undressing her with her eyes. It's a very subtle touch of acting that I felt was effective, and it's effective whether you're watching it the first time or the second time. The only weak link of the cast was maybe Elle Fanning, but that's more just because she's not really given much to do beyond just be innocent.
I mean, I think she plays it well, but there's not depth to the character, so there's only so much she can do. I'm not sure if I call her a weak link as a character, but I think her character's the weak link in the writing. I get what there is symbolically with her, but if they'd fleshed her out a little bit and given her some depth, like maybe even if it literally been that modelling was kind of this dream and she kind of had to reaffirm it to herself, that would have been enough for me.
She's like, oh, this is the only thing that I can do. Oh, I don't have any other talents. I only have my appearance. But that's almost the affirmation that is kind of all she is. It's not really like a character thing. It's more of just, again, an affirmation of the point that they're going for more.
I agree with you on that.
So the Neon Demon, I mean, obviously it's not for everybody. I don't know if it will depend on what mood you're in, but I think it will depend on your tolerance for extreme harsh content. I mean, if you're a fan of cinematography and you want to see something that is visual, then you have to see it.
I think for the cinematography and kind of visual style alone, it's worth watching. I think if you're somebody who's purely interested in narrative, I would perhaps give this one a skip. But if you're there for an emotional experience and you want to see something that is visually beautiful and is almost what I would call very much taking the show don't tell to heart, this is a film I would recommend.
I agree with that. On the next episode, we will be discussing, what will we be discussing, Jack?
The two Scott Adkin films, Ninja and Avengement, and kind of having a look at more Western martial arts films than we did the last time we did martial arts films, and seeing how we feel about that and how perhaps it differs from others.
Yeah.